I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Are you a mosquito magnet? Some people just seem to get bitten more often. How do mosquitoes choose their victims? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
To find out why mosquitoes bite some people rather than others, we're talking with two scientists who study mosquito behavior.
Some experts state that mosquitoes are the deadliest animals on the planet. Will Americans soon be at risk because of climate change?
What can we do to prevent mosquitoes from finding us? Besides DEET, what else works as an effective repellent?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, why mosquitoes bite you and how to outsmart them.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the Food and Drug Administration recently approved a new medicine to prevent HIV infection. There are already some preventive measures that can keep people from contracting the infection that leads to AIDS. Doctors call them pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. The newly approved medicine, called lenacapavir, requires just 2 injections a year. Gilead, the company that developed lenacapavir, has experience with other drugs against HIV and AIDS. The medication did surprisingly well in pre-approval clinical trials. Young women in Uganda and South Africa got 100% protection from the virus, an outcome that's almost unheard of in previous research.
The issue ahead is how many people at risk for AIDS will be able to get the benefits of the drug. Gilead plans to sell it as Yeztugo at a price of more than $28,000 a year. This will put it out of reach for many people in the U.S., especially as Medicaid coverage is cut. In addition, people in poorer countries will have great difficulty accessing its preventive power, since USAID and PEPFAR have been mostly dismantled. These previously provided the primary infrastructure through which people in Africa especially were able to receive AIDS treatment and HIV prevention. Experts estimate that in 2023, more than 1 million people worldwide became infected with HIV. Having a drug that prevents transmission of the human immunodeficiency virus more than 40 years after HIV was identified is a major accomplishment.
A readily available blood test for insulin resistance appears to reveal how quickly people with dementia will decline. Italian researchers tracked 315 non-diabetic patients who were experiencing cognitive decline. There were 200 people with confirmed Alzheimer's disease in this group. The neurologist tested all volunteers for insulin resistance by employing the triglyceride glucose index. This calculation, abbreviated TYG, is based on readily available, inexpensive blood tests. Patients who had high insulin resistance, as determined by the TYG index, declined much faster than people with lower insulin resistance. The researchers point out that neurons need glucose to function properly. Insulin resistance seems to interfere with that process and also allows for accumulation of amyloid plaque within the brain. People with ApoE4 genetic susceptibility to Alzheimer's disease are at greater risk. People can reduce their insulin resistance by increasing physical activity and reducing their intake of highly processed carbohydrates, including sugary drinks. Losing excess weight can also make a difference.
Treatment of depression has long been controversial. Medications come with a number of side effects, including suicidal ideation, sexual problems, and unpleasant discontinuation symptoms. A new meta-analysis reviewed 88 randomized clinical trials involving more than 5,000 participants. The trials compared transcranial electrical stimulation to sham stimulation. The authors conclude that transcranial electrical stimulation can improve symptoms of major depressive disorder with relatively few side effects. They point out that the results support more widespread use of this approach because of portability, simplicity, affordability, and minimal adverse reactions.
This is peak season for tick activity, and these arthropods have been spreading well beyond their previous ranges. Deer ticks are now found further north than ever, and the lone star tick is also headed northward from its customary southern habitat. What this means for humans is that prevention is more important than ever. In horribly hot weather, wearing long sleeves and long pants is unappealing, but it can help protect you from a tick bite that could give you a serious illness, like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Are you a mosquito magnet? Some of us seem more attractive to mosquitoes than others. Why is that? Could it be our smell, or are there other factors at work?
Today, we're talking with two scientists who are focused on answering precisely those questions. Figuring out how to outsmart mosquitoes is important, not just for our comfort, but also because these insects can transmit a range of disastrous diseases. Malaria and dengue fever have not been a big problem in the U.S. recently, but as the climate warms and mosquitoes extend their range, they could become deadly public health threats here, as they are in other parts of the world. Later in the show, we'll talk with Dr. Clement Binaget at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia.
But first, we turn to Dr. Connor McMenamin to learn more about mosquitoes and why they bite us. He's Associate Professor of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. Dr. McMenamin studies the molecular and cellular basis of mosquito attraction to humans.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Connor McMenamin.
Thanks for having me on today to talk about mosquitoes.
Well, speaking of mosquitoes, Dr. McMenamin, how in the world did you get interested in your home country of Australia?
Well, I grew up in Brisbane in Australia, which is in a state called Queensland, and it's a very tropical place. In particular, the area I live in is quite subtropical, with a climate sort of akin to Florida. So as a kid, I was always terrorized by mosquitoes, and I never thought in a million years that I'd make a career out of researching them, but here I am at Johns Hopkins.
How did that happen?
Well, in Australia, I did my undergraduate degree and I was going to be a doctor. And as I studied science as a prerequisite for entry into medicine, I came to realize that mosquitoes are actually a major vector of a lot of the world's worst infectious diseases.
Well, why don't you tell us what some of the worst ones are and some of the other diseases that you worry about?
Yeah, absolutely. So around the world, the most important mosquito-borne disease is malaria. Malaria still kills over 600,000 people each year. Most of those are actually children under the age of 5 years living in sub-Saharan Africa. Right here in the US, we used to have malaria until in the country until the 1950s when it was eliminated from the continental United States. But also, mosquitoes spread a range of other diseases experienced periodically here in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. Diseases such as dengue, for instance, which is similar to having the worst case of influenza you could ever imagine.
That sounds pretty terrible. Is that the one that's also called breakbone fever?
Yeah, that's correct. Breakbone fever. You get body aches, chills, sweats, and your bones feel like they're going to break. And despite not killing as many people as malaria, for instance, when you get a case of dengue, you're out of work for up to 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And you can imagine in some parts of the world, that could have a very, very large impact on the economy of those regions, particularly there's over 2 billion people at risk of dengue fever now around the world in various tropical and subtropical parts of the planet.
Now, Dr. McMenamin, I think a lot of people in the United States think dengue fever is something far away and exotic, but in reality, it's now in the United States.
Yeah, so periodically every year, there's introduction of dengue cases into different regions around the United States, particularly in Florida, also in California now, and parts of Texas as well. Um, it'll be very interesting in the future to sort of watch how these patterns of dengue transmission occur. Um, Dengue is spread by a mosquito that is akin to the cockroach of the mosquito world. This mosquito loves to live in and around humans' habitation. And it's a very, very hard mosquito to control because it loves to breed in very cryptic sites in and around people's homes, in rainwater tanks, for instance, gutters, small man made containers, all the way down to the size of a soda bottle cap, for instance. It can lay its eggs inside it there and breed.
So those saucers under your flower pots, that's a problem, right?
Yeah, in areas where you sort of experience sort of high seasonal rainfall and this mosquito is found, it's really important to sort of tip out your water from those sort of saucepans underneath your pot plants, for instance, or have drainage holes in there so that they can't accumulate water.
Dr. McMenamin, what we have discovered in North Carolina is if we are sitting out on the back deck on a summer evening with friends, some people get a lot of mosquito bites and some people get very few. My understanding is you have studied this phenomenon. Why are some people mosquito magnets?
Oh, it's the age old question, Terry. It's one that really drives my research program here at Johns Hopkins, trying to understand why are some people more attractive to mosquitoes than others, for instance. And in addition to being a really important problem during our backyard barbecues and hikes, for those living in areas where they commonly encounter these mosquito transmitted disease, how attractive you are to mosquitoes can also be really important risk factor for contracting diseases. So we're really interested in understanding one of the primary ways in which mosquitoes can find us, which is how we smell to mosquitoes.
Well, tell us more. What makes us, shall we say, succulent bait and attractive, and other people seem to be, phew, no mosquitoes getting close to you?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to realize is that around the world, there's about 3,500 species of mosquitoes. And of those 3,500 species, a handful have evolved this really strong, I guess, predilection to seek out humans and to blood feed on humans. And to find humans, mosquitoes use a really exquisitely tuned sense of smell. Much like us, they have a nose, believe it or not. Their nose is found on their head, at the antenna, and some other sensory organs. And to pick up on humans, they actually tune in on chemicals that we emit in our breath and also our body odor, including certain fragrances that are emitted from our skin surfaces, for instance. Um, what we've found in experiments that were performed in Africa is that some individuals who are more attractive to the mosquito that transmits malaria parasites emit certain chemicals in their body odor that make them rather alluring.
Can you tell us a bit more about possibly how you did that research to determine those chemicals?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Zambia, in southern Zambia, we established the world's largest multi-choice smell test for mosquitoes. You could think of this as a very large screened greenhouse facility, about the size of two tennis courts. Um, Surrounding this facility, we placed one person tents where humans can sleep, up to eight of them. And connecting the tents to this central greenhouse facility, we used repurposed air conditioning ducting. The whole idea of this experiment was to sort of establish a scent buffet for mosquitoes, where we could place humans inside of these tents surrounding this big screen greenhouse, and using a low speed fan, which was in each of these tents, actually sucked the scent of each human through this ducting onto hot plates positioned in the middle of this greenhouse facility that are warmed to human skin temperature. Each of these hot plates emits its own unique scent of each of these individual humans, such that inside of the greenhouse we can then place a set number of mosquitoes, which are ready to seek out and to feed, and then simply ask the question, which human scent do the mosquitoes prefer?
And what did you learn?
Yeah, so using video tracking above each of these hot plates, we could actually discern that the most attractive human in this particular multi choice smell test actually had a scent signature that was enriched for these molecules called short chain carboxylic acids. That's a very technical term, but basically it boils down to the fact that they had very, very stinky components typically found in bacteria that emit these compounds into the environment. Also, they had a scent signature that was enriched for another molecule called acetoin, which also is a putative product of the microbial metabolism of the microbes that live on our skin.
You're listening to Dr. Connor McMenamin. He is Associate Professor of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. Dr. McMenamin studies the molecular and cellular basis of mosquito attraction to humans.
It's time for a short break. In a minute, we'll find out how we can make ourselves less attractive to mosquitoes.
We'll consider mosquito repellents made from botanicals, as well as the gold standard, DEET.
Could we change our attractiveness to mosquitoes by eating garlic or taking B vitamins?
You'll also hear from another mosquito expert, Dr. Clément Vinoget. What deadly diseases do mosquitoes transmit?
Why are these insects so single-minded in their quest to bite people?
How far away can a mosquito sense a human being?
Do they just smell us, or do they use other senses as well?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you're like us, you've been doing your best to avoid plastic for years. The recent research on microscopic particles of plastic in our bodies causing us harm has made us even more determined to do whatever we can to avoid plastic, as well as harmful PFAS chemicals.
We've really been enjoying our Caraway non-stick and, most importantly, non-toxic cookware. It's so pleasant to use, and it's so easy to clean. It's a joy.
We were just as thrilled to learn that Caraway offers cutting boards that are not plastic. They're made of birchwood, no plastic, so no tiny pieces of plastic getting into your food. Plastic cutting boards shed thousands of particles of microplastic every time you use them, and those little bits of plastic you can't see or taste end up in your food and ultimately in you. Birchwood is a much better idea.
If you've been eyeing Caraway's internet-famous 12-piece cookware set, now is the perfect time to buy it. You can shop Caraway risk-free. Enjoy fast, free shipping, easy returns, and a 30-day trial. Plus, if you visit carawayhome.com/ppod, you can take an additional 10% off your next purchase. This deal is exclusive for our listeners, so visit carawayhome.com/ppod or use code PPOD at checkout. Caraway, non-toxic cookware made modern. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Today, the topic is how to outsmart mosquitoes.
We continue our conversation with Dr. Connor McMenamin, Associate Professor of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. Dr. McMenamin studies the molecular and cellular basis of mosquito attraction to humans.
Dr. McMenamin, I think most of our listeners are interested to know, well, what is it about my body chemistry that makes me more attractive, and how can I become less attractive to mosquitoes? Did your research reveal anything that we can apply to our own personal lives, whether it's diet or soap or perfume, or dare I say it, some kind of a repellent like DEET?
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the major findings from our study so far is that how attractive you are to mosquitoes is dictated by your own unique scent signature. To actually track towards humans, mosquitoes first smell you from a distance, and then they fly towards you. And then within a certain proximity to humans, they can see you. And then when they get close enough to your skin, they can feel the warmth from your body. Um, and so it's very, very difficult to control, emission of certain body odors into the environment and your intrinsic attractiveness to mosquitoes. But suffice to say that, washing periodically is never a bad idea. Secondly, covering up is another way to sort of minimize the dissipation of odor into the environment from your skin surfaces. Also, mosquitoes are picking up on chemicals that we emit in our breath. Obviously, it's kind of hard to stop breathing for a living human.
Not advisable.
Not advisable, exactly. So then we're left with, how do you actually, keep mosquitoes away from you? So again, covering up is a really important way that you can do that. Avoiding as well peak periods of biting activity. Typically, a lot of mosquitoes found in North Carolina and throughout the United States, depending on their certain preferences for time of day, they love to sort of feed typically in the evening hours. And unfortunately as well, that's when we tend to like to go outside for a barbecue, for instance, or a hike, or to sit on our porches. So then we're left with, how you can apply certain repellents to keep mosquitoes away from you. In our study, we actually found some very interesting sort of suggestions that perhaps certain compounds or chemicals found in our body odor may make us somewhat more invisible to mosquitoes. And there are a number of available repellents on the market, for instance, that have different modes of repellency.
Such as? Give us some examples, please.
Yeah, so when you're looking for a personal insect repellent, it's really important to apply what's called an EPA-registered insect repellent. Why EPA-registered? It's because these products have been vetted for some proven mode of efficacy against different mosquitoes found here within the United States. within the repellent landscape, if you like, there's a wide variety of products on the market, some with synthetic ingredients, such as DEET, for instance, which is a very well-known active ingredient, quite an effective synthetic repellent. There's also botanical alternatives as well on the market as well. And for those looking for a really good substitute for DEET, for instance, products with an active ingredient called oil of lemon eucalyptus is quite an effective substitute for DEET. In particular, products that have oil of lemon eucalyptus have an active ingredient inside of them called PMD. Which has a very long scientific name that I won't get into, but these are really wonderful replacements for DEET.
So when you go out on a hike, Dr. McMenamin, what do you use?
Yeah, I tend to like to use oil of lemon eucalyptus based products. No matter what repellent you apply to your skin, it's really important to look at the labeling instructions. Different repellents will require a different frequency of reapplication to your skin. It's also important to realize that a lot of these products, especially the EPA registered products, have been registered as such because they have a mode of safety as well. And it's important to follow those labeling instructions.
Dr. McMenamin, can we change our attractiveness to mosquitoes? So when I go out on the front yard, for example, it does not take long for mosquitoes to find me. Is there any way that I can, put on, let's just say, some kind of repellent or just change my diet?
Well, presumably the repellent would be the easiest way to do that. Otherwise, you'd have to change your skin microbiome, which I think is a very complicated project.
That brings up a very controversial topic, Dr. McMenamin, and that is some people absolutely swear that garlic in their diet or vitamin B1, thiamine, works. And then the scientists say, oh,
doesn't work,
forget about it. And I keep wondering, well, if your unique biochemistry, physiology, and all that stuff, some people may actually benefit, whereas other people may not. So help us understand some of this folklore, whether it's garlic or whether it's B1 or whether it's some other substance can actually make a difference.
Yes, I think this is a really fascinating area. And one, as you suggested, Joe, has a lot of anecdotes sort of, surrounding it. The role that diet could play in modulating your attractiveness to mosquitoes. From a scientific perspective, I think there's to date, very little sort of scientific evidence that diet can modulate sort of attractiveness to mosquitoes. But I think what is really required is some large studies to sort of, address these particular anecdotes in a very rigorous way so that we can get some really important information. For instance, in the study that we did in Zambia, the least attractive individual in our particular small screen that we did actually had a scent signature that was enriched in a chemical called eucalyptol. Eucalyptol is actually, found in a wide variety of botanical matter and also herbs and spices. It was originally, of course, described in eucalyptus leaves, but it's also found in a range of different products that you find in your kitchen, such as sage, cardamom, and a range of other herbs and spices. So I think it'll be very, very interesting in the future to, conduct sort of large scale trials, clinical trials, if you like, that, administer certain diets and also, perform the types of large scale behavioral tests, if you like, the multi-choice smell tests that we sort of have been pioneering to sort of begin to answer those types of questions.
Dr. McMenamin, what you're describing actually I find very intriguing because some of the studies that have been done that say, oh, well, thiamine is worthless and garlic doesn't work. And some of these old folk remedies, they're nonsensical because the assumption has been made that everybody smells the same. And so that if you do this quote unquote controlled trial with, 30 or 40 or 50 people, and it's not statistically significant, you say, well, that didn't work. Thiamine is useless. But I think what you've described is the fact that everybody's different. And so if you just take a random sample of 30 people or 50 people or even 100 people, you have, maybe 100 different scents. And some people are super sensitive and other people are much less sensitive. And so thiamine might work for some people, but be worthless for other people. Or garlic might work for some and not work for others. So trying to do a controlled trial could be really challenging.
Yeah, I think that when you do these types of experiments, obviously having a large sample size of humans is important to account for that variability in the way that we smell mosquitoes. The most dangerous mosquitoes for human health are those that sort of love to seek out human scent. So, despite there being differences between humans, there are also, shared components of our scent chemistry. Molecules such as carboxylic acids, for instance, all humans emit. We all emit carbon dioxide. And we also all have, common components belonging to other structural classes of chemicals. It's likely, the unique ratio specific scent blend, if you like, our own unique scent signature that modulates our level of attractiveness. But in terms of, chemicals or repellents that might work universally across humans, I think that's a really interesting area for research. Can we identify chemicals that we either apply to our skin, for instance, or via dietary sort of intake of these chemicals that could universally have, conserved modes of action across humans? I think that's something that we really need to sort of seek out, products that work well sort of across different humans, no matter how you smell to mosquitoes.
Dr. McMenamin, I'm curious to know how exactly your team identified carboxylic acid as one of the critical components that makes us very appealing to mosquitoes.
Yes, so we've developed techniques to sample air from the human body. In this particular experiment, we actually sampled air from the tents where humans were sort of sleeping, where we could derive the scent, test it for attractiveness to the mosquitoes, but also take a sample of that air onto a tiny little tube, a glass tube, inside of which there's resin. This resin allows us to capture the scent signature of individual human volunteers. We then take that resin back to the laboratory here at Johns Hopkins, and we can profile the scent signature of each human using an analytical chemistry technique called GCMS, gas chromatography mass spectrometry. And this is just a way to profile the individual chemicals that are found in human scent. So that's the way that we did it. We've also created other ways to profile this in the lab using a very large chamber, which is like a British style telephone booth, where again we can sample the air from humans and then chemically profile it.
Well, we find it kind of fascinating that some people absolutely insist that when they put Listerine, old fashioned amber Listerine on their skin,
Which, by the way, does contain eucalyptol, I think.
that mosquitoes don't bite them.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'll have to try that tonight. but, but yes, I think it's I think what's really required for a lot of these studies is to begin to sort of test, mosquito behavioral preferences for certain humans in a very sort of structured and rigorous way. Testing mosquito, preferences for certain humans is kind of difficult from a scientific perspective because in the United States, for instance, there's different mosquito species that live in different regions. Depending on your proximity to where they like to breed, there might be different numbers. And also, when you're in your backyard or on your porch, sort of relaxing, in the evening, you're always, surrounded by other individuals. Sometimes you're alone, but sometimes you're with different people, and each person might have, different relative attractiveness to those mosquitoes that live around you in the environment. So I think it's a very interesting scientific challenge, and one that we have to sort of make inroads to make a bite-free barbecue in the future.
Dr. McMenamin, I think a lot of people in the United States don't worry very much about mosquitoes because they go, well, there's no malaria here. And the only places where dengue fever is a problem, maybe like Florida, and I live in Minnesota, so it's not an issue for me. And I think a lot of folks just say, that's something that happens in Africa, maybe in parts of Australia and Southeast Asia, but here in the United States, nothing to worry about. But we're experiencing climate change. And, it seems like it's warmer longer in many parts of the United States. Do we need to start paying better attention to A, climate change, and B, ultimately mosquitoes carrying diseases like West Nile virus?
Yeah. So, no matter where you live around the United States, it's really important to remain vigilant against mosquitoes. It's never a good idea to, voluntarily be bitten by mosquitoes. Um, no matter where you are in the United States, there's always the chance of different viruses, for instance, circulating in mosquito populations, particularly West Nile virus. And in other regions of the US, as we've talked about, eastern equine encephalitis is also a major problem. So trying to remain vigilant against mosquitoes is a really great way to protect your family against the risk of mosquito transmitted diseases, as well as getting, those irritating bites that we all really hate to get. That's really important to avoid that. Um, in terms of climate change, I think moving forward, it's important to realize that as the sort of the world warms, there's going to be shifting sort of weather patterns, and also much like we have a preference for where we like to live, mosquitoes also have the same types of preferences. We could see, for instance, that mosquitoes shift in their distribution, pushing certain species of mosquitoes that, for instance, spread certain diseases into new areas. So, this is going to be a very important thing to watch from a public health perspective. But I think that the constant remains true to remain vigilant against mosquitoes. You owe it to yourself, your family, and also your communities that everyone lives in, to make sure that we, hope to maintain a bite-free future.
Could malaria ever return to the United States?
Yeah, so every year in the United States, we do experience sort of introductions of malaria um, associated with travel. So this is not malaria spreading within the United States, but individuals traveling from overseas and coming back. But a couple of years ago, there was actually local outbreaks of malaria in some parts of the United States, in Florida, Texas, and also here in Maryland as well, where individuals were able to be infected with malaria that hadn't traveled outside of those states. So, it's important to recognize that malaria was in the United States until about the 1950s when it was sort of eliminated. The reasons why it was eliminated was through sort of, large scale environmental modification, use of insecticides, and also the widespread use of air conditioning, screening homes, and also probably television. People sort of, went indoors for longer periods of time. But it's also important to recognize that moving forward into the future, the mosquitoes that transmit malaria have remained here. They're still found in the United States. And, with shifting weather patterns and, travel to different parts of the world, it's always a possibility that malaria could sporadically reemerge.
Dr. McMenamin, there are some people who really get nasty reactions to mosquito bites. I mean, most of us don't like mosquito bites, they itch, but usually within a day or three, the problem dissipates. It's not going to cause us much harm. But there are individuals who have something called skeeter syndrome.
Mm.
And oh my goodness, they get a mosquito bite. It's awful. Have you ever encountered anyone who experiences Skeeter syndrome? And is there anything that can be done for it?
So I haven't personally encountered anyone with mosquito syndrome per se, but when mosquitoes bite you, actually, they spit into your skin sort of a cocktail of different proteins that basically, from the mosquito standpoint, are sort of purposed to really facilitate its sort of drinking blood and blood for the mosquito is its primary source of food, so that they're able to, produce eggs. When humans react really badly to mosquito bites, it's usually an allergic reaction, which is usually due to, the differences in the immune systems of individual humans. So important, unfortunately for those with Skeeter syndrome, their body is overreacting to those mosquito bites. Much like any allergy, in a particular region, if you stay long enough in those regions, sometimes you can become desensitized to the mosquito bites so that you don't really notice them that much. But in other instances, it's much more severe in terms of the hypersensitivity to those mosquito bites. So, consulting a medical professional is really important in those instances.
Dr. McMenamin, we've talked about a lot of future research projects that you've got on the drawing board, as it were. I am wondering, based on what you now know, what would you advise our listeners to do to protect themselves from mosquitoes and any of the deadly diseases that mosquitoes can transmit? In some parts of the U.S., West Nile virus is a serious disease that can be transmitted by mosquitoes.
Yes, absolutely. Within the United States, West Nile virus in various regions across the United States is a really, really important problem, as well as in areas of the Northeast, triple E, Eastern equine encephalitis, another really important public health threat. So the major steps that people can take, within their homes to protect themselves against mosquitoes is to, number one, be aware of, the peak periods of biting of the mosquitoes in your particular area. Avoid those times if you can. Secondly, you can cover up to prevent mosquito bites. And, in conjunction with covering up, your skin surfaces, apply an EPA registered insect repellent and follow the labeling instructions. The final thing you can do is to really protect your home against mosquitoes. Obviously, window screens are really important ways to prevent mosquitoes entering your homes. But also, believe it or not, ceiling fans and air conditioning work really well as well to prevent mosquitoes from entering your home. Obviously, in your garden, removing standing sources of water is another really important thing you can do, and also removing as much foliage, down foliage or harborage. Resting sites for mosquitoes is another really great way you can protect your yard from mosquitoes.
Dr. Connor McMenamin, thank you ever so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks, Terry and Joe. Much appreciated.
You've been listening to Dr. Connor McMenamin, Associate Professor of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. Dr. McMenamin studies the molecular and cellular basis of mosquito attraction to humans.
We turn now to Dr. Clément Vénéger. He is an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biochemistry. His research area is molecular genetics of host-seeking behavior in insects.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Clément Vénéger.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Vénéger, we just spoke with Dr. Connor McMenamin at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health about mosquito magnets, people who are especially attractive to mosquitoes. He talked a little bit about some of the deadly diseases that mosquitoes transmit, like malaria and dengue fever and West Nile virus. But I wonder if there are any others that concern you before we talk a little bit about your research.
Yes, there are other, viruses that are transmitted by, Aedes mosquitoes or Culex mosquitoes. You may have heard of Zika, chikungunya, lacrosse. So there are several diseases, transmitted by mosquitoes.
Dr. Vénéger, why are mosquitoes so single-minded in their quest to bite people?
So they're not single-minded, actually. It's a very interesting question. Mosquitoes, there are about 3,500 species of mosquitoes, but only a handful of them are a problem to us. And the reason for that is that in this, handful of species, the females have evolved the ability to drink our blood, and only the females. So if you get bitten by a mosquito, it is not a male, it is a female. And they need our blood because it contains nutrients and proteins in particular. They need to nourish their eggs and produce babies, basically. And so they've also evolved the ability to track us down very efficiently because if you think about it, it's a challenging task. They need to find a resource that's hidden under the skin of an animal that moves and also can defend itself, right? And so that's why they're so interested and so finely tuned to detecting our presence and navigating towards us.
I'm curious, how far away can a mosquito sense that there's a target, whether it's a human or a dog or a cow or some other creature? I mean, is it 10 feet? Is it 50 feet? How good is their sense of smell?
So it really depends on the conditions, but some of those volatile components, those scents that we release through perspiration or the activity of our associated skin microbiome, so the bacteria living on our skin, for example, those are pretty light and can be transported, tens of feet away. But as the mosquito gets closer, they get more and more refined information about our presence. Right, because they can detect our, carbon dioxide that we breathe. They can detect our, body temperature or body heat when they get closer. The humidity that we release, through perspiration and also through our respiration. And also they see us, and there's actually work showing that they're finely tuned to detecting the colors that we all share in our skin, and so they can distinguish us from other animals and from plants and other resources in the environment.
What kinds of factors shape mosquito behavior?
So mosquito behavior, if you're thinking in particular in terms of the host-seeking behavior, so that task that females do when they track us down, it's influenced by multiple factors, right? The time of day. I'm sure you've experienced that if you have a barbecue outdoors with friends at 6 p.m., you'll get bothered by mosquitoes. But then if you walk across town at noon, you barely see any, right? And so each mosquito species will be sort of specialized for a given time of the day when they're more sensitive to our cues or signals. But other factors such as, the age of the mosquitoes, whether it's infected or not, and whether the female is mated or virgin, all of those will affect their sensitivity and their motivation to track us down.
I think most of us assume that mosquitoes smell us, But do they use other senses to detect a human target, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. As they navigate through space, mosquitoes, like many insects and a lot of organisms, they keep doing what we call integrating. So they integrate multiple sensory modalities, right? So their visual sense, their sense of olfaction. In some contexts, they also use acoustic, so auditory cues, type of communication for mating, for example. They hear each other and respond to each other, singing to each other using the frequency of how fast they beat their wings. So they always do that. They continuously integrate, all these sensory modalities to refine their approach.
Gee, the idea of mosquitoes singing to one another for mating purposes, that's a little daunting.
Yes.
Is that the noise they're making when they go in your ear?
Yeah, when they sing to each other, they have that courtship behavior where one of the sexes just increase their wing beat frequency, and if the other partner is interested, they'll try to match. So they really sing to each other, and they use females use those sounds that males produce when they swarm. So all the males get together in some spot and they sort of swirl in the air, and the females can also pick up acoustic information to navigate towards those male swarms.
Now, Dr. Vinerget, we understand that your laboratory has studied mosquito brains. Is that true?
Yes, so we are trying to understand what makes them so good at finding us and biting us. And in particular, we're interested in deciphering the molecular and neural mechanisms that allow them to find us. And so we have developed techniques in collaboration with others, such as the Riffel Lab at University of Washington in Seattle, that allows us to attach a mosquito by their head. So we have developed a 3D printed mosquito helmet, if you will, where the mosquito is attached by their head. And then under the microscope, we can dissect the head open and insert some electrode in the brain of the mosquito while the mosquito is behaving. And so that gives us a unique, insight in terms of monitoring the activity of neurons in the brain of the mosquitoes while they're performing some tasks, such as responding to smell and visual cues that indicate our presence.
You're listening to Dr. Clément Vinerget. He's an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biochemistry. His research area is molecular genetics of host-seeking behavior in insects.
It's time for a short break. When we come back, we'll find out more about how you study mosquito brains.
Will this research help us outsmart mosquitoes?
What can you do to avoid mosquito bites?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Sonu, an FDA-cleared drug-free treatment for nasal congestion and runny nose, a sound-based alternative to steroids. More at getsonu.com. That's getsonu.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're learning about mosquitoes and why they bite us. Specifically, why are some people, like me, mosquito magnets, while others don't seem to be bitten as much or bothered by mosquito bites? Is there anything we can do to outsmart mosquitoes so we're less likely to get bitten?
To answer those questions, we're talking with Dr. Clément Vinerget. He's an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biochemistry. His research area is molecular genetics of host-seeking behavior in insects. He was just telling us about his research on mosquito brains to understand how mosquitoes are responding to cues that signal human presence.
Dr. Vinerget, you mentioned that you are studying mosquito brains. I mean, I'm trying to imagine how big a mosquito brain is. It's got to be tiny. How do you get an electrode in a mosquito brain?
Yeah, it is tiny. I mean, the width of the brain is about 100 to 200 micrometers, microns, right? So it's very small. And so we design our own electrodes that are pulled out of glass and quartz capillaries. And the tip of those electrodes is 5 microns in diameter. So yeah, you cannot drink too much coffee before running those experiments. No shaking hands.
Yes, I can imagine that. That really, that's a very challenging idea. And what you have learned from studying these mosquito brains, how do mosquitoes change their behavior?
Yeah, so they use again all this information from us, right? How we look, how we smell, how warm we are. But it's interesting how those different sensory modalities interact with each other. For example, we've shown that if mosquitoes see something moving around, they might not be paying too much attention. But now, if they smell, let's say, carbon dioxide or CO2 that indicate our presence, now they start modulating the activity of neurons in specific regions of the brain that deal with their vision, and they start paying more attention and being better at tracking down moving objects, right? So that's one example of things we can learn by looking into the brain of those mosquitoes.
Well, it seems to me that a mosquito is going to want to be tracking a moving object if it's sitting on your arm, for example, and you're about to swat it, because after all, it doesn't want to be killed, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a risky business to be a mosquito, right? Because you need to get the blood and be as quick as possible, but not being detected by the host is mandatory, right? Because your ability to survive but also produce progeny is at stake, right? So we've actually shown that mosquitoes use their visual sense, and others have shown that they use so the displacement of the air when your swatting hand approaches them to detect that threat and then perform a rapid takeoff behavior. In less time than it takes you to blink your eyes, they compute an escape trajectory that puts them out of harm's way.
Well, I take great pride in my mosquito killing capability. When we lived in Mexico while Terry was doing her dissertation research, there would often be a mosquito that would get into the bedroom at night. And so my strategy was to leave the light on and to remain perfectly still with a lot of skin exposed. And then I wouldn't move. I'd be very, very still and wait for the mosquito to come, get closer, land, and then pow! I'd get him. And I was pretty good at this.
He was. And in the meantime, I was hiding under the sheet.
Right? But you point out that they obviously are very capable of avoiding predators like Joe.
Mhm.
But I'm curious, a lot of your research is devoted to learning how to outsmart mosquitoes because after all, as you point out, they are responsible for a lot of illness and many deaths every year. And as the climate changes and as we get more and more mosquitoes and more dangerous mosquitoes transmitting more and more dangerous diseases, we need to outsmart them. So, how does your research fit into that plan?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, mosquitoes kill about 700,000 to a million people every year, right? So in comparison, COVID killed about 7 million people worldwide. So every 7 to 10 years, you have as many deaths as from COVID, but from insect bites. So the way we approach that is we flip the system around, and we're trying to understand how mosquitoes outsmart us, so we can prevent them from doing that. Among examples, we figured out that mosquitoes can learn about behavior such as the one you describe in your bedroom, your strategy, and they can remember the association between how defensive you are and how you smell. So the next night, if the mosquitoes survive, they won't go after you, but will go after the next person because they want to avoid that defensive host, right? Other things we've been looking at are the things we do as human beings. We are a weird species of animals in the sense that we use a lot of personal care products that are scented and perfumed with plant chemicals. And so mosquitoes, both males and females, also track down plants to feed on sugars. And so we're trying to see how we can hijack that system so that we could use soaps as a measure to blur the lines between us and plants or make them repelled by our smell.
Well, you and your lab have done some research on soaps, which is fascinating. Will you tell us about the study, please, and then tell us what you found?
Sure. The story, originated from a personal observation. My wife and I are both mosquito researchers, and we have young children, and we're figuring out that when we were using some brands of soap on our son when he was young, he would get bitten by mosquitoes in our backyard, but with other brands, he would not. And so that prompted us to look into that. And so we recruited some volunteers and, selected some soaps based on their popularity in the US market. And we looked at both the chemical composition of the volunteers' smell after they washed themselves with those soaps, and looked at how mosquitoes would react to the smell only of those people before and after they were washed with those soaps. And we found out that three out of four soaps that we tested actually increased mosquitoes' attraction. And in spite of having a lot of chemicals that are typically seen as repellents for mosquitoes, like limonene, which come from citrus plants like lemon. And one of them was actually producing the opposite effect, where mosquitoes were less attracted by that soap when it was used by volunteers. And that one was a soap that was scented with coconut flavors or scent. And so we looked into the chemical composition of that soap and identified some chemicals that, when put together, are reducing mosquito attractiveness.
Well, I need to know
We all want to know.
which brand of soap is the best brand to avoid mosquito bites.
So that soap in particular was of the brand Native, but I think it's more about the scent. There was a coconut fragrance, and that I think that's what's driving the effect, because others in the field have shown as well that coconut oil derivatives or essential oils are also producing a similar repulsive effect.
So possibly any soap that's made with coconut oil might have that same benefit that you found with native brand soap.
Possibly, yeah. We have not tested that explicitly, but that's what I suspect.
So, are you suggesting that maybe using some sort of coconut oil moisturizer might be beneficial?
It could be. I mean, the basis of that research is to identify the chemical rules that explain mosquito behavior, so that we can inform back the cosmetic industry and tell them, hey, when you put these chemicals together, you're making things worse. But if you select those other chemicals, maybe we can engineer some new combinations of fragrances that have the opposite effect on repel mosquitoes.
Some of our readers and listeners have reported when they apply the mouthwash, Listerine, the old-fashioned amber Listerine mouthwash, to their skin, that mosquitoes don't bite them. So maybe there's something in Listerine that is kind of offensive to mosquitoes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's what's interesting if you think about it from a chemical perspective, is that it's not like we have some chemicals that are unique to plants, some chemicals are unique to humans. I mean, there are some, but there are also a lot of overlap between different resources. So really what defines a human from a chicken, from a plant to a mosquito, is the, precise combination of all these different chemicals in the plant. And the more people look into that, the more that's what, we have evidence that that's what driving mosquito behavior, that specific combination and ratios between chemicals, instead of just the presence or absence of a given chemical.
Dr. Vinerche, we know that mosquitoes and other insects can develop resistance to, for example, insecticides. And I want to ask you whether or not mosquitoes are evolving resistance to some of the other strategies that we use to discourage them.
Yes, absolutely. And there's another kind of resistance. It's called behavioral resistance. An example of that is a study conducted in the early 2010s in some villages in Africa, where bed nets were deployed as a method to control mosquitoes, in particular those Anopheles mosquitoes that transmit malaria from biting people. And so, insecticide-treated bed nets were given for free to the population, so they would sleep under the bed nets. And those Anopheline mosquitoes, they're typically nocturnal, so they're active in the early night, and then they try to bite people, through the night, pretty much. And what that team found is that, if you deploy those bed nets and come back multiple years after people are starting using the bed nets, the malaria cases were starting to rise again. And when looking at the mosquitoes and their behavior, they found that those mosquitoes that are typically nocturnal started to shift their activity patterns. So they would become active in the early morning when people would start to come out of their bed nets. And so this is just an example, but mosquitoes do that all the time. They keep, adapting to what we do and trying to find other ways to access our blood.
Do you have recommendations based on your research for how we should be protecting ourselves, utilizing your scientific findings?
So, all the discoveries we make could be used to inform what every one of us does, right? In terms of tweaking the way we perfume ourselves or wash ourselves, also dealing with what we do in our habitat, and making sure we don't have any resting water around the house in summer, because that provides sites for mosquitoes to breed and produce more eggs and more mosquitoes. um, but then I would say, if you're in an area where those vector-borne disease or mosquito-borne disease are highly prevalent, or if you're traveling to a part of the world where there's a lot of transmission, the best recommendation would be to use some of those gold standards mosquito repellents, such as DEET and others that are, very, very effective. That's the best way to protect yourself.
And what do you do when you're trying to avoid mosquito bites?
So exactly, what I described about managing our environment, making sure we don't have resting water, and if you can use some plants in your backyards that are not also highly used by mosquitoes to get access to their sugar. There's a lot of work going on in the field right now showing that mosquitoes are highly selective for those plants, and they can feed actually on a lot of the plants that we grow in our urban environments. So all of those ornamental plants, for example, they really like it. And so we make things better for mosquitoes by planting them around our houses. And so selecting for plants that are less preferred by mosquitoes would be another good strategy.
Well, how would we find out about that? Because I definitely don't want to make things better for mosquitoes.
So if you go to some nurseries, there is already some labels on some species of plants, indicating their attractiveness for mosquitoes. So that's one way to start. But then beyond that, it's a nascent field of research, and so I think more results will be coming up in the next few years.
Dr. Vinochet, we talked briefly with Dr. McMenamin about home remedies. That some people seem to believe that if they take vitamin B1 or even eat a lot of garlic, they can avoid mosquito bites. In your experience, is there any truth to those approaches, or is your number one recommendation something like DEET, or Dr. McMenamin mentioned
Oil of lemon eucalyptus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question that calls for a very complex answer, because I think some of those things that we often attribute to folks' tales probably have some scientific veracity behind them. I mean, some of that is pretty true, but in the real world, there's such complexity in the environment that mosquito lives in, right? And so multiple factors can affect how we'll attract those mosquitoes. And there is a lot of things that we do that could also influence that. For example, if you drink beer or alcohol, you attract more mosquitoes. If you're a woman and you're pregnant, you attract more mosquitoes. So I think it's not one factor, but the combination of all those things that eventually will matter to the mosquito. So it's not as simple as, I'll drink more coffee and take more vitamin and be good, right? And I think, personally, what I like to think about is adjusting my behavior, right? So if I do something and I notice that anecdotally I'm attracting more mosquitoes, I would tweak my behavior to see that reduces the attraction.
Dr. Clément Vinochet, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Clément Vinochet. He is an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biochemistry. His research area is the molecular genetics of host-seeking behavior in insects, and we've been specifically discussing his research on mosquitoes today. We spoke earlier with Dr. Connor McMenamin, Associate Professor of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. Dr. McMenamin studies the molecular and cellular basis of mosquito attraction to humans.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Sonu, an FDA-cleared drug-free treatment for nasal congestion and runny nose, a sound-based alternative to steroids. More at getsonu.com. That's getsonu.com.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
Today's show is number 1436. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you could share your comments about today's interview. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning. On this week's podcast, you'll find out how Dr. McMenamin's research team identified carboxylic acid as a substance that makes us especially alluring to mosquitoes. Also, can you use Listerine as a repellent? And Terry, what are the ingredients in Listerine that might be nasty?
One ingredient that mosquitoes might not like is eucalyptol.
That's what I thought. And when I say nasty, I mean nasty, smelling for mosquitoes. That's right. We'll also explore what climate change will mean for mosquito-borne diseases like malaria. And we talk about Skeeter syndrome, really nasty reactions to mosquito bites.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter. That way you get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast. And speaking of the podcast, we'd be grateful if you would write a review of the People's Pharmacy and post it to your podcast platform.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.